Just to start, what's your initial reaction to this story? I want to go to Charles, you, and then Renee. I would love to hear your reaction as well.
Yeah, I think it's a sad story. I mean, something went wrong. Clearly, I can't really unpick that knot in Kenya between the government and cocoa. Really though, I think we need to focus laser like on the demand side. Right now, there's still more benefit for companies to do nothing on climate rather than to take action and do something. Cocoa shouldn't have needed an NOA, an NLOA or a CA with if we actually had the appropriate demand out there in the market from multiple different sources, whether it's Corsia or Article 6, 2 or 4 or voluntary, compliance, voluntary markets, all of those things, are the needed sources of demand. If we keep letting companies off the hook, either regulatorily by not putting in place regulatory markets, or by failing to pressure them to take action voluntarily, you know, this is the sort of thing that's going to happen.
Welcome back to This Week in Carbon. I'm your host, Eddie Smith, here with my co-host, Rene Velasquez. And today we're joined by Charles Bedford, Chief Impact Officer at Carbon Growth Partners. Charles, thanks so much for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Yeah, so to start, it would be great. I know you've had a long career in this space, but it would be great maybe for the audience if you could just take us through your career journey and what drove that progression to where you are today.
Sure. No, I probably have one of the least replicable career paths of anybody on the planet. I'm educated in sort of international relations, and then a graduate degree in law, and practiced law for a while. Was in government, in politics, even in the NGO sector, and now the finance world around climate finance. And so when people say, "Well, how would you progress or suggest I find a path, a career path?" I say, well, the main thing, don't think about the actual, the job itself or the industry or the topics. Think about what you really like doing and what you can add value to. And that's where I've sort of found that the risk taking from a career perspective just pays off in the long run, right? You end up in doing these really interesting work. As a lawyer, ended up being a governor's lawyer in the U.S. for the state of Colorado in his office, and natural resource policy guy. Ran political campaigns kind of coming out of that because of my exposure to that sort of political setting. I then ran a state agency, natural resources agency in Colorado. And then from that went to the Nature Conservancy for 20 years. Did great stuff all around the world, starting in Colorado and then Beijing. Helped to start a Mongolia program for the Nature Conservancy. Myanmar, helped to build a China program, and started a program in New Zealand, in addition to kind of working on super complicated issues like carbon finance and fisheries management and river management. And so that was a super great background platform to jump into markets. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, philanthropy isn't going to solve all of these problems that we have, right? From a biodiversity crisis, climate crisis, poverty alleviation. Philanthropy can help, philanthropy can catalyze, but ultimately we have to do a couple of things. One is get the right policies in place, and then relatedly deploy the power of markets and capital markets in particular through policy-driven markets, right? Whether it's biodiversity conservation or carbon regulation, climate regulation, and climate finance. These are the solutions that have to really take that philanthropic initial impulse towards scale. So that's the sort of theory of change for my career. I loved being, reinventing myself in my kind of late career as a carbon finance guy. That's been super interesting, and learned a lot from everybody I've spoken to in the market. It's a fantastic market from a learning perspective. Everybody's really thoughtful about how to build this market so that it can accomplish the things that it needs to accomplish with respect to climate.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. And In your current role now at Carbon Growth Partners, could you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Rich Gilmore and I left the Nature Conservancy and took about 5 or 6 others with us to create the Carbon Growth Partners about 5 or 6 years ago, and we found a terrific third partner with John Coffing, who has a great background in the derivatives markets. And the three of us really said, let's see how we can get in the middle of these markets and add value, especially in the nature-based solution space. And my background is really, as a lawyer, focused on land tenure issues, community-based conservation, politics, and government, as I mentioned before. And so my role with Carbon Growth Partners is really in that sourcing. Like, how do we find the right investments? How do we find the right people to invest in to get these projects done on the ground? And in the carbon market, that means getting deep in places like Cambodia and Colombia and Ghana and Kenya and China to understand who are the actors, where are the trend lines, how do we support the right people doing the right stuff in the right places? So that's what my job is really the sourcing of investments and really trying to help to structure them, because the market's still very immature and some of those structures don't really exist on the ground. So bringing
Mhm.
that kind of partnership approach is what I do.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, before we get into some of the specifics on market structures, I want to touch on, big story recently about cocoa networks, right? And it'll be great to get your opinions on this, given that you're a lawyer. So last week, Kenya's clean cooking startup Cocoa Network shut down operations and laid off its entire 700-person workforce after the government refused to issue a letter of authorization, which is required to sell carbon credits internationally under Article 6 and other compliance mechanisms like Corsia. So just to start, what's your initial reaction to this story? I want to go to Charles, you, and then Rene. I would love to hear your reaction as well.
Yeah, I think it's a sad story. I mean, something went wrong clearly. I can't really unpick that knot in Kenya between the government and cocoa. Really though, I think we need to focus laser-like on the demand side. Right now, there's still more benefit for companies to do nothing on climate rather than to take action and do something. Cocoa shouldn't have needed an NLOA or a CA with if we actually had the appropriate demand out there in the market from multiple different sources, whether it's Corsia or Article 6, 2 or 4 or voluntary, compliance, voluntary markets, all of those things, are the needed sources of demand. If we keep letting companies off the hook, either regulatorily by not putting in place regulatory markets, or by failing to pressure them to take action voluntarily, well, this is the sort of thing that's going to happen. From a Kenyan perspective, it's hard to know what's going on and to read the mind of the Kenyan government why they're doing this. But
Mhm.
the notion that hey, we're not going to give an LOA because we need to count these credits and this carbon mitigation in our NDC, our nationally determined contribution, is kind of crazy, because they're not going to be able to count the credits in the NDC at all if they don't happen. Right. If these projects don't happen because you fail to give an LOA, nobody's going to do them. Right. If they're not financeable, nobody's going to come to Kenya and say, okay, I'm going to build these stoves and distribute these stoves anyway. So really, I think what needs to happen, and maybe will ultimately, is Kenya and cocoa and other developers come to the table and say, okay, what's the right deal here in terms of satisfying our NDC, but also driving investment on the ground in projects. The big issue, though, for me is cocoa, through no fault of its own, done great work. Was out there looking for a market that is sort of relying on this single source of demand, of Article 6 demand. That shouldn't be the case, right? I mean, we should have plenty of sources of demand around this.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'll chime in with my thoughts. I think it's really disappointing for the market overall to see this result. Because, I mean, let's not forget, 700 people were employed by that company. We, being in the market, know many of them as good people. And I think, that human cost is obviously going to be felt as part of this winding down of the business. It's easy for a lot of different competitors in the market to gleefully call out someone else's failures. And I see that all the time in the market.
Mhm.
It's this kind of schadenfreude. But it's not the time to do that. What we need to do is try to find an outcome here that's beneficial to the people in Kenya, right? To the people that are actually users of these cook stoves. And ultimately, the Kenyan government has got their sovereignty and the decision-making around LOAs and the corresponding adjustments. And I think that there's some sort of conflict there between the two parties, but that'll be borne out in litigation. And I think, once all the details are out, I think we will have that. There's speculation that, that this will go to court and that effectively cocoa having a meager investment guarantee was a backstop. I don't think that that's as clear cut as possible. I think that there's a lot of gray areas in between around the claims. What we hear and what the media is widely reported is that the Kenyan government was hesitant to issue those LOAs and make the corresponding adjustments on numerous bases. Effectively, there were concerns around overcrediting of the cook stoves credits coming from cocoa, and it relates to the methodology that they were using and the FNRB that they had. And ultimately, the demand or the concentration risk essentially that cocoa represented to Kenya, I think, played a role. And I think that this is what we're hearing certainly around different circles, where they would have taken up a disproportionate amount of the government's, say, float of LOAs to distribute essentially, or otherwise have to, struggle to meet their NDCs. I think that that's the concern internally, and I think that that's caused that friction. To Charles' point, I think having been dependent on Article 6 and CORSIA markets specifically, and then having this rate limiting step of the LOA coming through or not coming through, has ultimately resulted with their business not being viable. The way that they structured their cook stoves were essentially the cook stoves were distributed as loss leaders, right, in order to then make it up on the carbon side. So when that went away, the whole business turned upside down. It's really unfortunate to see. I think it will have also significant impact on the free float of eligible emission units under CORSIA, because a lot of folks expected that this huge influx of credits would be coming in, and now a big chunk of those are effectively excluded. I don't want to sort of sound too negative, because there's also really positive stories in the same week that CORSIA supply is up 10 million tons essentially, with Guyana issuing more volume, and now I think it's a total of 9 projects having issued volumes and having their credits tagged. It's a proverbial drop in the bucket effectively, right? The demand for CORSIA Phase 1 remains significant. The Singapore Air Show is on this week, and I was at a roundtable discussion yesterday with a number of airlines. The airlines seem to think that effectively that their demand is evident to the market. It isn't, because it's not being distributed, or at least the price signal is not being distributed through exchanges and or on herds very well. And most airlines that are starting to engage are doing it in small bite-sized pieces on the spot, and then trying to secure supply on the forward side. So we're just seeing the start of this market, but there is a short squeeze coming for CORSIA. Nonetheless, if we think about it just in notional terms, 200 million tons of demand is somewhere in 165 to 200 is the demand that's forecast for this phase that's ending this year. For an industry that continues to grow and then goes into compliance next year, is going to be material. And if supply remains constrained because of things like that are happening with Kenya and this cocoa situation, where the LOAs remain a bottleneck, that just constrains the supply, which leads to increased volatility and an increased price ultimately that will be paid by airlines and then borne by passengers down the line. And that's not constructive. And so, I think hopefully, again, looking on the positive side, there's a resolution for the people that have been affected here through this outcome here with cocoa, and I think that they've got many great people that will end up finding placements in other companies, right? That's just the natural situation. To pick up that slack, I think, would be the challenge that I would say to many other business leaders in the carbon space. And then, beyond the human component, ultimately encouraging governments to take a much more proactive approach to creating very clear pathways for the issuance of LOAs, so that the rules are evident and clear for project developers to avoid these types of risks in the future, and ultimately stimulate more and more investment on the upstream to yield supply for markets that are essentially there but haven't yet crystallized. And I'm pointing fingers at CORSIA. Article 6 is another one. Again, Article 6 on the 6.2 side depends on the bilateral agreements. So again, the impetus is on the governments to start to sign those bilateral agreements in order to create those channels to market effectively. And so I think we're in this really interesting inflection point in the market. We get these sort of gut punches like this, but ultimately there's still these building blocks that need to be built up, but the future remains strong as long as we can actually get the deals structured and confidence is the key. So sorry, it's a long answer, but just it's an emotional thing because there's so many great people there. So
I think
just commiserations to everybody involved.
Let me sort of riff on that a little bit, Rene, and to step back. Like if you take a little bit of a step up a bit and look at the MEGA guarantee, the World Bank guarantee that this potentially triggers, whether it's paid out or not. I mean, who knows? The lawyers will take years to unpack that. But frankly, what we're talking about here is using carbon finance to finance infrastructure, needed infrastructure in the global south, right? And this is actually one of the very few projects on the planet that does have these kind of guarantees. And this is the sort of guarantee that you get when you're doing and deploying infrastructure like pipelines, like roads, like airports, et cetera. And so this is the sort of model, and actually having the model, be played out, as sad as it is actually it's a good indicator that we're moving into a mode where we're looking at the carbon market as more of an infrastructure development tool as opposed to a nice to have papering, your green credentials from a voluntary perspective tool. So I think absolutely miserable for people who are no longer working and this project, which is a great project. But it's a sign of market maturity in a lot of ways. Like these guys put together a very smart structure. There's a guarantee that is potentially triggered. So let's figure out how to do it again and again and again and again, because that's what's going to make this market work.
Yeah, look, the repeatability is going to be the key, because if every transaction is bespoke at the government level in order to yield the emission units, it just does not scale. And so what we need is both speed and scale. We talked about John Doerr's book last week on the pod, but that's really key for this market, right? Because we cannot just have it every single time at bat be discoverable and bespoke. It's fine for the first few times, but as you said, we learn from mistakes, and governments are a key actor in the transactions. In Corsia, there's three counterparties, not just two counterparties to any deal. There's the buyer, the seller, and the host country, right? And and it relates to Article 6 transactions, same thing. In fact, you got four because you got the other country on the other side, and so it's really important that these processes actually being implemented, and we learn from the mistakes of other countries, and we also highlight where things are actually working. I'm buoyed in that capacity building kind of component. Next week here in Singapore, they're hosting the National University of Singapore in US is hosting an entire, I think, week of conversations with ministers and folks representing different governments and many different carbon market experts in order to work through some of these problems and ultimately try to implement it and create the right laws, the right governance structures, the right systems in place so that projects can actually start to deploy capital. I think risk, appetite is on in carbon with a lot of the developers, and they're going in there and they're trying to implement these projects, and there's financing that's available behind that, but they need to have a clear line of sight to the outcome. Right. So that then match that with the buy side, as you said, Charles, because if the buy side doesn't materialize, then it's all kind of, it's a moot point. But if we can just get through that, then I think it'll be beneficial to the market. But it's really unfortunate to see this bankruptcy. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't comment about it on the show. I don't want to speculate. I don't want us to sort of do too much sort of hot takes or anything like that, because obviously conscious of the human component. I think over time we'll start to discover more and more, and we'll reach out to folks that, and when the time is right, that they can have this platform to show their side. And that's sort of my piece.
I think it does raise some fundamental questions that I would like to get your guys' opinions on. I mean, ultimately, if host governments if they can simply refuse to give letters of authorization, what does that say about the viability of the entire system? I mean, what does that say about the viability of Article 6 market itself? And also for investors looking at this in the global north, I mean, these are some of the reasons why a lot of investors in the US, I mean, they don't like to deploy capital in countries that have high amounts of political risk, right? I mean, they need higher returns for that political risk. So I think it does raise some fundamental questions about the viability of Article 6 if governments can simply just refuse letters of authorization. Do you have any thoughts on that, Charles?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I don't think it's a fundamental question. I think it's just glitchy, right? I mean, this is there's something funky happening here that, we're not privy to. I think it sounded like at the beginning of their partnership between Kenya and Cocoa that things were, going down the right track. Who knows what went wrong? I think this is less a statement of around the market as a whole in Article 6 and its functionality as it is a glitch around this particular, relationship. Absolutely, it's going to, spook investors who are wanting to invest in Article 6, projects in the Global South. We have a partnership on a project. Carbon Growth Partners has a partnership on a project in Senegal, where the government's the partner and the actual project developer, and we're the financier, and others are working on the project development, your sort of consulting side. So there's one where you've sort of changed the dynamic a little bit and put the government in the front seat. I think similarly you can see this in when you involve and engage indigenous communities on nature-based projects up front, and they have a different political stature in a country than just a developer vis-a-vis a regulator like that. So I think this is glitchy and not symptomatic of systemic problems. I think we'll go through this process. We'll see where they get. A bet would be something comes out of this particular issue, and I think it probably helps to sort of define some of the investable boundaries for Article 6 projects. Well, we'll see, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I agree with that. I think it's better to qualify it as a glitch in the system. I think that there's a clearly, like in bilateral disputes, there's some dispute that's going on there that I don't think is evident yet to the market, but there's something there, right? And so over time that'll get borne out, and we'll understand it. Once there is that litigation, some sort of resolution here. But to your question, Eddie, I don't think that it represents a systemic issue. The way that it's structured, because you're coming up against the sovereignty of countries here, right? But the system was designed that way. And I think ultimately the sovereignty cannot be questioned, right? If these projects are operating in a country, they've got those pathways voluntary purely or under this Article 6 framework. And if they're going to operate in that way, then they need to engage the government and operate by their rules. So ultimately, that's just how it's drawn out. It's going to be inefficient. In the beginning, but I think all technological and sort of paradigm shifts are inefficient in the beginning, but I think systems improve over time, right? And there's an iterative process to improve.
Learning by doing. And
there's a huge learning by doing aspect here, right? And I think it's because there's also, in terms of the governance, who owns the decision making? Is it finance, environment, ministries, et cetera? And it's going to be different in every country. But ultimately, once they pave that road, proverbially or metaphorically, then I think if you have clear guidelines and rule sets that you abide by, and there's profit sharing and sort of levies, et cetera, then this is going to become an export market for those countries and become a revenue potential for those host countries. So I really like, Charles, what you said before around infrastructure building. Right? The governments can actually see this as a way to A, encourage investment in their country, B, essentially export a new commodity, C, actually create jobs in their country, and ultimately leads to better infrastructure, right? And I think it could be a win-win-win across the board, but you need to have that strong governance and strong systems in place. I think a lot of lessons will be learned from this. I think the fact that the World Bank is party to these conversations, giving that meager guarantee, I think those lessons will be distributed fairly in the market long term.
Yeah. Well, talking about infrastructure, nature is certainly, in my view, a form of infrastructure and as an asset class. And I'm glad that we talked about the Cocoa Network's story. I'm sure we could talk about that for another hour, but I think we should transition towards some of our other sections. And in this section, I want to talk about permanence mechanisms and the nature-based market, which is something Charles is really intelligent about. So let me just frame it up for you, Charles. Permanence is a fundamental challenge for nature-based projects. Trees burn, forests are logged, land gets converted, but the market has developed various mechanisms to address reversal risk. So to start, it would be great if you could walk us through some of the main permanence mechanisms, insurance, buffer pools, etc., and who benefits from each, right? I think you've been a voice on these topics, so I would love to hear your perspectives.
Yeah, no, I think it's a super interesting problem. I guess to sort of take a step back, you look at essentially nature-based solutions. Most of these solutions for nature conservation and carbon-related nature conservation have come out of government approaches and NGO approaches over the last, 150 50 years, really, since conservation started. That means that governments draw lines on maps, NGOs try to help to get protected areas declared. And what has come up more recently is the ability or use of carbon and biodiversity finance. So financing through a regulatory process or through voluntary processes to protect nature, protect the carbon sink, protect biodiversity. So how do you do that, right? I mean, the construct is like, okay, we know we have a set of carbon sinks around the world that need to be protected and restored, right? We also know we have a set of biodiversity hotspots and biodiversity, habitat spaces that also need to be protected. In many cases, those things overlap, and some they don't. But, you have rare desert that don't sequester a lot of carbon, but a lot of these places overlap. And so you think, okay, well, how can we protect these things? Can we draw lines on a map, and is that effective? Well, it turns out in a lot of cases, no. Drawing lines on a map and creating a park around a biodiversity hotspot in a forest, tropical forest, doesn't work sometimes. One of the so what do you do for that? If you're trying to essentially do that kind of protection, you have to do a counterfactual, which means you essentially say, well, here's what would happen if we didn't protect this carbon sink or this biodiversity hotspot. And then you essentially credit against that, right? And that it's a hard thing to do, right? We're creating a fiction about what a future would be versus what we're actually going to do and how we're going to intervene. And that's a tough thing to quantify and to measure and then maintain over time. So I think there may be a little bit of reframing that needs to happen in this nature-based solutions world. What we're really paying for here is the long-term maintenance of natural infrastructure, what you said earlier. How do we manage and maintain that? Is it always essentially measured against the forces that would destroy it? Or is it measured against the value that it retains for us? So you get to permanence. We need these places to be maintained forever, right? These are the natural infrastructure upon which we rely for everything, air, water, food, et cetera. So if that's the case, how do we get to these permanence mechanisms that we have now in the carbon market? And then are there other options that we can tackle in other markets like the biodiversity crediting market or habitat banking models? So what we have now is like insurance, which is relatively new to a carbon project can get delivery insurance, political risk insurance, all sorts of different sort of triggers for insurance. We talked about the MEGA guarantee from the World Bank, which has you could do that. You can apply that sort of guarantee as well. That works. Well, what's it really doing is actually saying if this project fails, which we don't want it to do, right? We don't want a carbon sink to get logged and the biodiversity to be destroyed on these places. So the insurance essentially pays the buyer, or the seller, depends upon how they've allocated the risk. And we have people walking away from the table, but the project has failed, right? Similarly with buffer pools. Buffer pools is just essentially a registry managed insurance product. So you basically have, well, okay, this project failed, and so what are we going to do about that? We're going to cancel a bunch of credits out of the buffer pool, and then that'll make everything right, except the project. So those are the essentially current permanence mechanisms that are out there. There's a few other ones. What I have evolved in my thinking towards is how do we actually protect the land, right? What is the mechanism and tool that we need to have in place to protect that carbon sink over time? We know we want to, take that apart from the crediting mechanism. Like we know we need to credit this somehow and we need to value it somehow. The only way we've really got a chance to do that right now is the counterfactual of what would happen if we didn't protect it. So what can we do, that would take this to a next level, would actually permanently endow or permanently engage protection on these biodiversity and carbon hotspots? And I think things like long-term endowments, which you do find in occasionally a RED project. Occasionally RED projects have long-term endowments that set aside. Generally, they're internal and not third-party. The biodiversity, the habitat banking market, I work as an advisor to Terrasos, the Colombian habitat banking company, which I think is a terrific example of a group that has worked to create a market and protections around the lands that they're protecting from for a habitat perspective through a long-term endowment, right? Held by a third party and dispersed upon any sort of problem like a fire or illegal logging or whatnot, that then goes in and actually takes care of the property itself forever or for however long the property or the project lasts. So I think those are more creative and more thoughtful ways of dealing with permanence that do two things. One, they protect the buyer and the seller, but they also protect the land. So I think we need to rethink some of these permanence notions and stop thinking. I get the point that a lot of people bring, that we need to financialize these markets in a way that that gets buyers and sellers comfortable. But I also get the fact, after spending 40 years, 30 years on conservation on the ground, that it's about the ground. It's about the implementation.
So the argument that arises from that is that, the market actors, there's a need for liquidity and tradability over actual conservation and nature-based infrastructure outcomes, right? There's that kind of rubber band that's pulling each, right? That's what I get from.
Yeah, but I think if we call this out and we create a set of mechanism, an endowment mechanism, whether it's pooled or individual project by project SPV type of endowments, that should satisfy market actors, buyers and sellers. Really, I mean, if you've got somebody who's willing to set aside some chunk of those early payments into an endowment that then essentially is, going to take care of this property for a long time, that should satisfy this stuff, right? I mean, that should satisfy the liquidity needs. These are really about claims and about regulation. And so, voluntary claims and about regulation. So it really depends upon how you set those claims up, as well as the regulatory structures. And I think the Colombian example is quite a powerful one.
Can I jump in? So I'm just curious, like, I completely agree. And I'm saying you're such an expert on this, and it's great to hear those insights. I agree. Like, I think permanence, durability, but it's this requirement essentially that these emission reductions can last essentially. And this reversal risk is being always the Achilles heel of nature-based solutions. And this is a recent development, but I'm just going to throw it in there. But, I've been a long time advocating for, like, as you said, this intersection between buffer pools, which are managed at the standard level, and then insurance and the two intersecting. And it seems like that's the moment now. Verra recently announced their version 5 of the VCS standard, and they're introducing a pilot initiative to enable project developers to use insurance or like a fund-based approach. Are you familiar with that at all, Charles?
Yeah, and I don't think that's I think I haven't dug into it really closely, but I think you could, as a project developer, red project developer, you could create your own captive insurance project, right? I mean, captive insurance is a thing. It's been around for a while. I think some of the red projects, I can't name one off the top of my head, but I know I've run across a couple of them that have sort of a form of that, kind of an internal captive insurance piece. I think you need a third party, some sort of trust management entity to make that real. So I think maybe there's a way to ensure that the insurance payments go out to the project as well as to the buyers and sellers, and that there is a way to sort of integrate that notion of protection of the land, because we're worried about is reversal risk, right? If you have a fire, well, okay, bad thing, there's been emissions, but what's going to happen to the property ongoing? Well, it needs to get restored, right? In many cases, it actually has to be actively restored in order to hold carbon and to deal with the biodiversity loss. So you need to have that longer term expenditure on the actual property, on the project itself, and that our current mechanisms don't, for the most part, to tackle that issue.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think what they're proposing here, and I've been thinking about this, and I think we've got the Verra folks coming on a future episode, so I think they'll be able to comment on this expertly. But essentially, there's some inadequacies with regards to the current buffer pool mechanism. Essentially, there's a levy that's placed on the total issuance, and Verra just withholds those tons and essentially does that across the board for all projects. And if there is a reversal risk, then they effectively retire credits from that buffer pool to kind of make the system whole. And in principle, that looks good, but there's no, to your point around the continued protection of the project, there's no A, liquidity event, and B, no money that's set aside for that restoration work to occur. And I think this fund-based approach that's being proposed here as a pilot, if it can actually be scaled, and essentially I'm thinking the insurance companies have the balance sheet. right? They can price the risk. They can write the premiums accordingly against it, right? And those will be variable, subject to variability. But if you're a project developer, you get a liquidity event for those credits that are in a buffer, but you put that cash aside. That's actually beneficial, because that could actually be used as that did you call it easement? Yeah, I think it was easement was the word. And I think that could be interesting, kind of an evolution of the current system to be more aligned with financial markets, but not at the detriment of the actual set on the ground.
Absolutely.
Because I think that's often forgotten. It's like, oh, well, that project failed, we won't trade that anymore. And it just price goes to zero. What happened to those communities that you promised revenue to, that worked hard with you and actually were stewards of this land for such a long time? And oftentimes it's not because of their fault, because of potential climate change issues, drought, essentially, that forest fires have occurred and they get wiped out completely and off the map. And then people just say, oh, well, I'm not going to invest in nature-based solutions. That's the opposite of what we need. We actually need more investment into nature-based solutions, because that's our get out of jail free card. Like, we need to actually utilize this and protect what we have, and then restore what we already lost or destroyed.
Yeah. I think there's, and there's mechanisms out there that can do this. And I don't know enough about it. It'd be fun to plumb into a little bit what's going on with the changes. There are the Colombian habitat banking regulations, require this. That's the regulatory approach from a biodiversity offsetting perspective. And these are regulatory requirements for pipeline developers and roads, et cetera. Another example is, the Americans have a similar sort of habitat banking system. They also have these essentially set aside endowments, conservation easements, which are essentially a transfer of the development rights of a property from a commercial entity or a landowner to an NGO. Often have these funded long-term management endowments, and I think these tools are out there. And trust management is a whole science, which we could definitely get into. You should get somebody from Northern Trust on the podcast sometime.
Yeah.
They're super smart about this stuff.
Thank you for the reminder.
Yeah. Philippa's lovely and fantastic spokesperson, and just the cleanest thinker on some of this stuff that I've come across. And I think what they can do and what they can help the industry do is structure these things in a way that we're ensuring and guaranteeing nature, which is what we want, and actually what the buyers want and the sellers, right? They want to have that insurance, the nature be insured itself, not just the liability, the claim, the transfer, the transaction. So I think there's ways of having our cake and eat it too on this. And I just wanted to raise this. It's something I'm deeply interested in.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think also, we've reached out also, the ICVCM has got I think it's called the Continuous Improvement Work Program or something. But they focus on permanence, and they released something last year. We should reach out to them as well, because I think this dovetails nicely. So food for thought. We'll include a number of those folks that you mentioned. Let's get the Vera guys, Northern Trust, and ICVCM folks on the pod to talk about this very intricate issue. But I think it comes down to confidence in the underlying instrument at one level, and then the other is the ensuring the protection long term of these nature-based assets. And Eddie, to your framing, I think that was right on to kind of come full circle, that nature is part of infrastructure, right? In our world, but it's been undervalued. And I think that we now have this opportunity to really price it accordingly and value it accordingly, because it's got so many impacts with regards to not just the biodiversity, but our food systems, our actual weather systems, and our water systems in particular as well, in addition to doing the benefit of locking up CO2. So it needs to be intrinsically valued.
Yeah, it's very hard. It's very, very hard to quantify the economic value of nature that isn't being used. And I think that's one of the fundamental reasons why the carbon markets are very complex and some of these projects are very difficult to quantify, like the additionality aspect. You start to get into all these paradoxes because of the difficulty of some of this quantification. And that brings me to our next section, which is a perfect transition, which is biodiversity credits, which are an emerging next major environmental market. Unlike carbon credits, which quantify tons of CO2 avoided or removed, biodiversity credits aim to quantify improvements in ecosystem health, species populations, habitat quality, and biodiversity outcomes overall. So it's multi-dimensional. And, Charles, you seem to be deep in the trenches on biodiversity credits at Carbon Growth Partners. And I'm super keen to discuss some of these, the dynamics of this emerging market. But to start, how do you measure biodiversity credits or biodiversity itself in a credible
Mm,
way?
yeah,
No
yeah.
pun intended.
Right. Well, I spent 20 years at the Nature Conservancy, and the joke there was, you get 12 scientists in a room and ask them to come up with a way to measure biodiversity, and they'll come up with 13 answers. So it's it's not it's not an easy deal to do. But basically, though, my preference is simpler rather than more complex. And there's a number of biodiversity standards and measuring standards out there in the world these days. Essentially, though, you really need to do two or three. You need to do three things. Basically, you have to say, look at a spatial aspect of it, and then a temporal aspect, and then the nature side of itself. From a conservation or biodiversity conservation preservation perspective and accrediting perspective, those are the three elements. How big? What's the space that you're looking at? 10, 100 million hectares. How long are you going to conserve it for? And then what's there? And what are you going to be doing to it, right? Preserving, conserving, restoring, et cetera. And so there's a set of formulas around there that all of these biodiversity crediting standards use. I'm particularly fond of, and I'm advisor to Terrasos. And the reason I'm fond of it is a great group, and they do fantastic work both in the voluntary and the compliance market. But it's based on a regulatory standard that Colombia has set up, essentially. This notion of, X hectares for 30 years doing X, Y, and Z things on it, right? And guaranteed, as I talked about before, in an endowment approach where you have a sinking fund that makes sure that you can, recover a property and when if it burns, and manage it, adaptively over that period of time, because that's what conservation is. It's adaptive management. So you have to fund that up front, or else it's really kind of a meaningless line drawing mechanism. That's why I'm enthusiastic about this. It brings a different set of mechanisms to nature conservation than what I had traditionally worked in the government and then in the NGO sector. It gets beyond the line drawing and the park declaration mode. It gets into the finance aspect of it, actually, and so that's what I like about the biodiversity piece. Measurement itself, there are complexities around that. So you have a you do a baseline, and then you figure out what's happened on that property, what's in need of restoring, what's in need of preservation, and then you do an annual measurement of that over time. I think it's a mistake to get too much beyond to treat it as a here's where you get to the kind of the nut of the problem. I think it's a mistake to think of the biodiversity credits as similar to carbon credits. They're not commodities, right? These are actually, instead of a commodity approach, these are essentially cost-based units of conservation. So, right. So with all of the biodiversity crediting mechanisms, whether it's the UK, US, Colombia, which are sort of the three leaders, essentially use the same notion, which is what is the cost of this thing to do over time? There may be a premium in certain habitat types where there's a higher demand and it's harder to get jobs done and things done. So it is tradable, but it's not really a commodity in the carbon sense. A ton doesn't equal a ton of biodiversity, right? So that's where I think, thinking about this as more of essentially a really clear view on what it's going to cost to maintain biodiversity on a property over time.
Yeah, I like that distinction. And I think it's an important one to make. So thanks, Charles. The difference between carbon credits and biodiversity credits, like you said, in carbon, we have 1 atmosphere. And so 1 ton is essentially equivalent, hence the tons of CO2 equivalency nomenclature that we use in India versus Colombia versus Brazil versus, like Croatia, right? Like ultimately it's the same atmosphere. And so you can actually do that accounting there. And obviously the questions are around the validity of the claims and is a ton really a ton? Cool. Conversation for another time. But in biodiversity, it's highly localized, right? So there's this localized aspect to it. And I think that's the interesting piece. I think to your point, it answered a question that I have constantly, which is what's the key driver for the demand? And as you said, when it's linked to a compliance mechanism, and therefore it's a cost that is passed on through that supply chain, it's going to be material to these businesses to ultimately to make these investments. And so I think for that, it is really important. And if we have an obligation to protect the biodiversity, because ultimately if we have a biodiversity collapse, then we're cooked basically. And so it's really, really important. I think it's interesting that a market-based mechanism can actually be leveraged. But to your point, I don't think it becomes a liquidly traded market like commodity markets. And carbon is further ahead in that development chain, but we've also had a number of setbacks that have decreased that liquidity. Hopefully we can start to unlock that, as we discussed earlier in the piece, to try to get back that level of liquidity. And there will be segments of the market that are commoditizing carbon, I believe. But then there'll also be basis spreads to things that have additional co-benefits. And if you have a carbon project that has biodiversity benefits and you can equate them through the different crediting systems, then I think that's also another approach for companies to look at in terms of the financing piece. But yeah, it's got to be linked to the compliance and vice versa. Right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that the habitat banks that I've looked at in the U.S. and Colombia, they all have carbon benefits that they're not actually being paid for, right? I mean, this is a free rider, similar to the nature-based carbon projects. There's theoretically, there was a premium for biodiversity in the carbon market. I think that vanished with the collapse of the RED project market. I think that's probably going to come back, but it goes both ways. And there's some funky questions around additionality with respect to stacking or bundling of bio credits and carbon credits, which need to get sorted out. Deep in the weeds on that. But the use case, which I think, Eddie, you mentioned earlier, and Rene, I mean, you got to kind of go country by country and set up these regulatory systems. And that's happening as we speak, right? Everybody realizes that we're going to have infrastructure development in the developing world. We want that, but we also don't want that to come at the cost of wiping out biodiversity. And so what's happening across the developing world is steps towards creating a biodiversity or habitat banking system. So where the polluter / the developer builds into that front end of their infrastructure development cost, they build in the cost of the restoration of like-for-like habitat in the same neighborhood. And that just makes a lot of sense, right? That's part of the mitigation hierarchy. It's something that, I think people can agree on, and it becomes a rounding error in the cost of a dam or the IFC, the World Bank Group, and all of the major development banks, including Equator Principles banks, have all essentially required this for 15 years. The problem is they haven't actually enforced it. So they've gotten wrapped around the axle how to measure species impact of a dam in Guatemala or a road that they're financing in Brazil and so they've got wrapped around that axle. I think they can really take the development banks can really take a lesson, I think, from the Colombia and American examples of, it's about habitat. It's not about individual species. Let's get going. Let's build this into the infrastructure, right? It's natural infrastructure, which needs to be maintained, just like these built infrastructure.
Yeah, 100%. Super interesting and complex topic, which we'll certainly cover another time. But moving into the last section here, there's this ongoing narrative and a growing narrative in the past few years in the global north that carbon markets are problematic. I mean, this has been going on for decades, but more recently, there's been critiques about credit quality, concerns about offsetting itself. There's been academic studies questioning additionality. We saw the UC Berkeley one on cook stoves. And these concerns have led to buyer pullbacks and increased scrutiny the past few years, and obviously the market has reacted to that. But Charles, you've wrote about this, and you've argued that the North is getting something fundamentally wrong. I mean, what do you think that the global North is sort of missing in this context?
Too big a question. Rene, you'll have to help me on this one. What's the global North missing about the global South and the needs? Look, I mean, I think there's a few things, and I'll give a little bit of an anecdote or story about this. So I was working in Colorado for the Nature Conservancy in the early 2000s and talking to wealthy people about conservation and getting conservation done around the world. And I ran into a number of very wealthy American business people who are like, look, I care about my backyard and I don't trust the regulatory systems and the durability of conservation in the developing world. I just don't trust it. I'm not going to fund it. There's basically a prejudice against the global South and developing world. And it shows up in that kind of philanthropic context. It shows up in the way that investors price risk in developing markets, right? In emerging markets, right? You see the discount rate for Laos is essentially makes it an uninvestable place, right? And the fact that it's an uninvestable place makes the discount rate more higher, and it's a looping problem. So this is that whether it's philanthropy or investment, I think the global north really sort of is prejudiced against the sort of engaging on this. Now, of course, there's always examples. You can go back to the cocoa problem where, we thought we had a deal with the government and the government's now backtracked. Maybe, we'll see. But you also look to some place like Cambodia, which has been absolutely solidly, consistent year in, year out for the last 25 years on what carbon markets can do for that place, right? And they've absolutely, opened the door. Now they also have problems, right? There are projects which have come under scrutiny. I'm sure there are issues around governance there, but there's a country which has basically said, we're open for business. We understand the value of our forests and the biodiversity and the carbon in these places. We need help in figuring out how to finance the protection of these places. So let's get going. So you have these kind of, different examples out there. And I think the global north, sort of New York, London-based investment community sort of says, well, it's just too risky. You know what? It's too risky not to invest in the global south. And guess who is investing in the global south? China. And they're investing in ways that are I think, full spectrum, right? I mean, they're working with governments, working with local communities. They're certainly making lots of mistakes, but they are essentially saying, we care about developing these markets and we're not going to price risk so that it's impossible to invest in this place. Say what you will about methodologies and the Americans. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, fundamentally racist things coming out of the mouths of some of my American friends about China. But look, they're out there, they're financing critical infrastructure all around the world. They're building the Bogota subway, right? They're building ports and roads and pipelines, and they're doing it, and they're taking on a fair bit of risk. So I think we need to rethink how we think about risk in the global south and figuring out how to bring the same proportion of people out of poverty that the Chinese government has brought out of poverty in the last 30 years, half of its people. Now, I'd like to see that happen without the corresponding problems that happened in China during that period, where all the rivers were dammed, soil pollution happened, air pollution still bad, lots of impacts on the environment. But I think we can do that, right? We have to get ahead of this, and we have to be competitive. The world needs to be competing with each other to drive investment into the global south.
Here.
Really well articulated.
Yeah, look, I don't know how much more I can add on that. That was really eloquently said, as always. Yeah, look, there is this dichotomy between global north wanting this perfection, right, and expecting this level of financial sort of rigor around the underlying assets in developing countries, but also at the same time wanting to take advantage of achieving the emission reductions at a much, much lower cost. And that just doesn't compute, right? So the reality is, and we're not going to move away from this, the global south needs to see this finance actually make its way into these countries to help to build that infrastructure, to take countries out of poverty and create another means for those communities. What they get in return, the buy-side countries and the buy-side companies, are that they get to compensate for their emissions. Again, it comes down to the sort of the weakness of the enforcement because of the lack of compliance systems broadly. Obviously outside of the EU and certain states in North America, for a large part of the economies globally still don't have emissions regulations and or penalties. But it's positive that many are starting to pop up and we're starting to see more and more broad coverage. But those that demand signal needs to be distributed more broadly in order to incentivize more and more investment. I think the Article 6, look, it's been slow to implement. We're now 11 years at the end of this year since Paris was ratified and we got the rule book and then we're starting to do implementation. But I'm really hopeful that rubber starts to meet the road and we start to see this become not only transactable again, not just bespoke, but we actually have pathways for LOAs. We actually start to see the liquidity emerge in terms of these bilateral highways that are being signed through implementation agreements now between governments here in Singapore. We've obviously got agreements with numerous countries that are ultimately creating that flow. The government of Singapore stepping up and taking a really active role, and now they just closed an RFP, or they hosted an RFP. They still haven't announced who's going to make it through to the next round, but they had 52 respondents come through. And that's really positive because it's actually trying to match that supply with the demand. And the demand seems to be uncapped at this stage. They didn't cap it, which is a positive signal. But we need to see more and more of that being replicated, not just in Switzerland, not just in Singapore, and not just in Japan, but we need to see that more broadly. And then those signals are being distributed to the companies that are operating in those countries. And that's when we start to see more and more flow of the financing working. And I'm hopeful that Article 6, even through its imperfections, can actually create that demand signal. Same thing with Corsia. It's imperfect. There's a lot of lack of clarity and a lot of over complexity. But again, as that demand signal starts to really manifest and be discovered in the market or felt in the market, markets have an easy way of responding, that they'll try to fill that supply and demand imbalance. And I think we're seeing that already. Positive signs are that there are numerous investors that have been sitting on the sidelines for quite some time that are looking to finance carbon projects. Now, albeit they'll only finance the top 1% of projects that have de-risked numerous risk sort of gates. And that's because there's a lack of hedging tools in the market. There's no established benchmarks right now across futures, et cetera. I think we overcome that in the next 5 years. And that's when I think we see this huge paradigm shift and the market really taking on size. And then hopefully we can start to address this imbalance, Eddie, that you kind of framed in your question.
I think, Rene, that is a really important point. The Article 6, it's a kind of a tragedy that it's taken 11 years to put the rules together on this. And, 6.4 is, I think, no end and no particularly deadline in sight where we'll see a 6.4.
There are optimists who say that we'll start to see the first credits under 6.4 this year.
Yeah.
Great, if that happens.
I hope that's true. Don't believe it.
I'm rooting for them.
Yeah, me too. But, look, you went through a list of Article 6 buyer countries. I think you missed the biggest and most important one, which is China. And I don't want to come across as an apologist for China. I've lived here for 20 years and understand a little bit about the warts, for sure, of China's development trajectory and path. But I also understand that when they make a international commitment like they did with the Paris Agreement, and it was a dramatic, big commitment in 2015 when they did make this commitment, completely unexpected. When they make that kind of commitment to do what they're doing by 2030, they'll make that happen, right? One way or the other. And what's happened, interestingly, recently is that they put in place a national carbon market after having 8 pilot markets around the country for 10 years. They put in place a substitute market, a voluntary, not voluntary, but essentially a pressure valve market for carbon projects for polluters to use in place of reductions. So a very clear regulated market, very similar to the California market. They're going to cover all of their emissions as opposed to just the power sector before 2030. They will peak emissions, may have peaked last year. They'll definitely peak by 2030. So this is a country where, it's got its act together. And what's very interesting is to see in the last year progressing from private conversations to now public conversations of participation in the Article 6 markets, right? And this is something that's very brand new. We see it, as Hong Kong playing a role in that, being a window in and out of China for Article 6 credits. We think that bodes well for the market overall. We see China's got a 10 billion annual ton emissions, and they're going, they're working hard to ratchet that down over the next 20 years. And they'll need the help of, nature-based solutions in Mongolia and Indonesia and Africa, in those same places where they're financing, infrastructure projects. So I think that their action and engagement in the carbon market is super interesting to watch, fast evolving. I think we'll see Article 6 credits trading, 6.2 credits trading into China within the next 18 months. It's happening. It's not an if, it's a when at this point. It's, when you have vice ministers publicly saying, we will be participating in the Article 6.2 market, that means it's going to happen.
Yeah, and I don't doubt that. I completely agree. I think it is a sleeping giant. And there are really positive signs, like you said, with regards to having a national market. And they've been in development for a very long time, being very pragmatic around how they do it. And it creates a potentially huge source of demand. At the same time, China is putting on the most renewables anywhere globally in terms of megawatt hours that are being generated, and so they're really doing the work in terms of that transition piece. And to something that you said earlier around who's actually investing in the global south, and China has become, over the last 15 years, 10 years, really one of the most dominant funding sources globally. basically dethroning a lot of the multilateral banks that in certain countries. And I think that their Belt and Road Initiative, I don't think is spoken enough about, but I think that that's a sphere of influence that China has that has been very diplomatic. And I think that that could then be leveraged through infrastructure investments to ultimately yield the outflow of Article 6 units to help China to meet its commitments. And if that does happen and essentially China fills the void that the US is essentially creating now under Paris Agreement with the current administration, then I think that that's a huge game changer. But China plays the long game, and so I'm not going to say that that's our prediction that that's the panacea to the whole situation. I think that they're going to be very, very astute in terms of the timing, but nonetheless, I think that they're stacking the deck right now. So I agree with you.
Absolutely. No, it's fascinating to watch and fascinating to see how quickly it's coming. You guys should do a China focused episode soon.
Yeah, that's a good
Yeah,
plan.
that would be good.
All right. Thanks. You've given us a
Already
whole bunch of stories to focus on.
Well, I have to dream up stuff for my students to study. I teach at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, mostly graduate students from mainland China, and they are absolutely hungry for these market-based solutions. It's a market solutions, whether it's biodiversity, and also in the biodiversity space, they're absolutely pioneering a number of different biodiversity standards in mainland China. I mentioned Terrasos earlier. They're helping out in China from Colombia. Great South-South collaboration. So there's a lot of hunger from my students to really participate in these market-based solutions to these problems. Chinese society and people and the government really get the power of markets. It's what's made the place the way it is today, including, it's a regulated market and subsidized market. You mentioned the renewable energy boom. I went to Shenzhen a couple of weeks ago, big city across the border from Hong Kong. There's barely a gasoline car on the it's all quiet.
No, the EV market's insane. Yeah.
It's nuts. And they put in more renewable energy last year than the rest of the world combined has ever put in. Right?
Yeah, that's just like, but
shocking.
That's the magnitude of what China can do. And I think once that sleeping giant wakes up, it's a wrap. And like I said, the auto industry is completely transformed as a result of companies like BYD, et cetera, in EVs. Things that we thought would take decades in China can actually happen in a much, much shorter time frame because they understand the power of speed and scale, right? And they don't have the lack of capital. They don't have the lack of innovation. They're no longer in that sort of old view of China being the copycats of the world. They're leading in terms of innovation and design and implementation, and more importantly, execution. Because if you have a look at infrastructure in China, it's mind-blowing. And they could stand up a hospital, they could stand up a bridge, they could stand up anything in a matter of days, not years. And I think the West has completely lost that level of speed and scale and coordination at an engineering capacity, and China's just light years ahead right now.
Yeah. You don't.
So yeah, I'll take a challenge. Let's have a China episode.
Yeah,
I'll reach out to you offline and maybe get some recommendations for folks.
Absolutely. You don't want to downplay the warts and the problems and the environmental issues and other issues, but it's a
human
pretty
rights
stunning
issues, a bunch of other things. Yeah,
China is the leader in
transformation.
Gas emissions. Yeah, but look, really,
way to bring it down, Eddie.
Hey, I mean, we're going to talk about how they're leading in, renewable energy technology. Yes, they need more abundant energy. They have 1 billion people in their country, a lot of people. So they need as much energy resources as they can get. And with that renewable energy has also come, like 6 new coal plants every month, I think. So it's, it's not all leaders of the energy transition when you're by far number one in pollution, but that's a conversation for another time. Regardless, though, Charles, thank you so much for joining us. It's really been a pleasure, and we covered a lot of different topics, but the work that you're doing is really great, and it's good to have you on the podcast. And
it's my pleasure. Yeah. No, it's my pleasure.
Really
look, you guys do a great job of bringing these markets, sort of market issues up, kind of laying them out on the table, bringing people into this conversation. I think it's a terrific service you do. I mean, I think the some of the things we've talked about are philosophical. Some of them are market oriented, and some of them are very in the weeds. But super fun conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, likewise. Come back anytime, Charles.
Sounds
really
good.
Appreciate the time. Awesome.
Cheers.
All right. Have a good week. Cheers.